Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Pope Francis's Vatican has okayed Freemasonic idolatry in the Pope's Cathedral. Maybe you've seen it making the rounds on Twitter and on Facebook, but a Anglican Mass, it's not really a Mass, it can't be a Mass, was celebrated in the Lateran Basilica. And I'm going to show you a tweet here from Protect the Faith on Twitter. This is Deacon Nick Donnelly, and he wrote, Pope Bergoglio has allowed Anglicans to say, quote-unquote, Mass in the Lateran, the mother church of the Catholic Church. Would he allow the SSPX to celebrate Mass at the Lateran or even allow the traditional Latin Mass? I think not. Bergoglio is a liberal Protestant, not a Catholic. So what you see there is you actually see an Anglican service taking place in the Pope's Cathedral. And before people think that this is perhaps not verified, it has been verified. And I can show you, this is Facebook of some Anglican minister. And he wrote, Father Lee offered Mass at the Archbasilica Cathedral, the Most Holy Savior, and of Saints John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, in the Lateran for all the faithful of St. Philip the Apostle, South Tottenham. I guess that's some Anglican diocese or parish. And he goes on to say, St. John Lateran is the cathedral church of His Holiness Pope Francis, and his cathedra throne can be seen behind Bishop Jonathan, who was our principal celebrant. You can see here images. This is Bishop Jonathan Baker, I believe is his last name, preaching, I guess, and more of him preaching. This is one of the ministers taking a selfie at Mass, because, of course, that's what you do as a minister. You take selfies at Mass. And there are just more images of this. This would be the lead up to the fake consecration. And there are more and more pictures. There's Pope Francis's chair. This is the chair of the Pope, the cathedra. And anyway, here you go. Bunch of pictures. So, if you're just joining us now, the Vatican has okayed a Freemasonic idolatrous rite to take place in the Pope's Cathedral. I'm going to go through 4 points here that make this extremely concerning. So where does the Freemasonic part come into it? Well, the bishop that we saw, Bishop Baker, he's not just a bishop of the Anglican Church. It's bad enough that an Anglican would celebrate Mass within, or not Mass, but you know what I'm saying, their fake Mass within the Pope's Cathedral. But what actually is more stunning about this whole thing is that the principal celebrant, this Bishop Baker, this fake bishop, he actually is a Freemason. He's a practicing Freemason, and this has been established. There was an article from The Telegraph from 2011, I guess, and the Archbishop of Canterbury allowed a Freemason to be bishop. And it goes through in this article basically the Church of England's position on Freemasonry and how in the past this position had been somewhat contentious, and usually Freemasons were not allowed to become bishops within the Church of England. But if you actually go and you find the quote here from the bishop, here it is right here. This is the bishop who celebrated the fake service, the fake Mass in the Pope's Cathedral. And he said, for many years, I have been an active member and I continue to be a member of Freemasonry. This came up in discussion with Rowan, who is the Bishop of Canterbury, but it has not caused a problem for me at any stage of my ministry, and it won't cause a problem now. He went on to argue that it would not interfere with his role of overseeing traditionalist parishes, and said he saw no conflict in being a bishop and a Freemason. He said, I've never found it to be anything other than an organization that is wholly supportive of the Church. Now, of course, he's speaking about the Church of England, as there is no possible way that he could say that Freemasonry is supportive of the Catholic Church. It's clearly the sworn enemy of the Catholic Church. Freemasons have been anathematized a dozen times by different letters from popes and different statements. It is impossible to be a Catholic and be a Freemason. You excommunicate yourself from the church by joining a Freemasonic lodge. So what we see here is it's not just that the Vatican okayed a fake religious service or a false religion's service. That sort of thing, sadly, we would see as understandable given the current climate, meaning not that it's understandable that it's good, but I mean, that something sacrilegious or ecumenical took place within the Vatican or within the Cathedral of the Pope. This is something that is totally normal nowadays. I mean, we think of Pachamama, we think of all these interreligious rites, we think of the Assisi prayer meeting with Pope John Paul II back in the 80s. I mean, this is kind of old news, sadly. But this goes one step further. This is a Freemason who is a fake bishop of a fake church, who is the principal celebrant of a, quote-unquote mass in a Catholic cathedral. Not just any Catholic cathedral, but a cathedral for the Pope of the Catholic Church. Another reason why this is astonishing is because Anglicans are heretics. They are not Catholic. Their church is not a real church, and they espouse doctrines that are completely despicable. In addition, the actual bishop himself, the quote-unquote bishop, he is divorced and remarried, which is, of course, impossible in Catholic theology. So not only is he a Freemason, but he's a divorced and remarried Freemason. So the Vatican permitted, and don't be confused, don't think that this somehow happened. I mean, the Pope-splainers will say things like, well, they technically didn't, know what was happening and so forth. No, of course they did. You don't get to go in and set up for a mass service, whatever, without there being the checks and balances in place. That's just not how it works. And they celebrated this Freemasonic, idolatrous, heretical service in the Church of the Pope. Here's the thing. If you actually look into what it means to have a church consecrated, if you have your church consecrated, then after something that is heretical, sacrilegious, an abomination of some sort takes place within the church, traditionally speaking, you actually need to have that church reconsecrated or consecrated again. What has happened in the Lateran Cathedral Basilica is a Freemasonic, heretical, schismatic, whatever you want to call it, Anglican ritual. This is a desecration. And here's why. If you look at these images again here, if I just pull these up, you see here that what they're doing is preparing for their consecration, which is not really a consecration. You see here that they're doing, basically the Novus Ordo, and they're kissing the altar, which is a Catholic altar, which would mean that it would have to have relics of a saint in it. So think about just for a moment just how unbelievably scandalous that is. There is a saint of the Catholic Church, the relics of a saint, within an altar, assuming that the altar is done properly, and they're kissing the altar as if they're going to celebrate a mass, but within this altar is an actual Catholic saint, or the remains of a Catholic saint. This is the kiss of death. This is not a kiss of a mass. This is not a kiss of a Christian Catholic service. This is an Anglican, heretical, schismatical, Freemasonic organization. The next level of evil that takes place at this is you have to understand the Anglicans don't actually have the Eucharist. They don't actually have a consecration. This means that when they perform their consecration, they're kneeling down and worshiping something that is not God. So what takes place is not only superstitious, but it is actually idolatry. They're worshiping a piece of bread. They're worshiping a false god. So if you're just joining us here, to reiterate, not only is the bishop who is the principal celebrant of this heretical service a Freemason who is divorced and remarried, Not only are the Anglicans heretics, because you could be a heretic but still have a valid consecration, technically, if you're a valid priest. Not only are they invalid priests masquerading around, playing dress-up, but in the actual Anglican service itself, there is a faux consecration. There is a fake consecration. This means that when their fake Eucharist is elevated, that the priest, the fake priest, will say, this is my body, etc. This is a grave offense against God, because this person who is a Freemason, who is divorced and remarried, a heretical bishop of a heretical schismatical church, this person is acting in persona Christi, but he's not. And then he's elevating a host, which is not the Eucharist, and then they kneel to the host the way that you would genuflect and kneel to God, but this isn't God. Now, we can kneel to things out of reverence. So, for example, before a crucifix, you may kneel and pray, but you don't kneel and pray thinking that the crucifix itself is divine, but instead kneeling is a prayerful posture, and you kneel down and you adore the mystery of the crucifixion, and you pray. This is an aid to prayer. But when this faux consecration takes place, and you kneel down and say, after saying, this is my body, etc., this is an act of idolatry. So to reiterate, a Freemason of a heretical, schismatical church is, performing a fake consecration of a non-Eucharist in the Lateran Cathedral, which is where this is the Pope's Cathedral. This is a desecration of a cathedral of Rome. This cathedral needs to be reconsecrated. This place has been desecrated. This is as bad or worse than Pachamama. And here's why. You see, what's more deceiving? What's more egregious? What's more offensive? Think about an analogy here. If somebody is just an intruder into your home and does something bad, this is just terrifying and horrible, right? This is just bad. If somebody pretends to be someone they're not and deceives you in order to intrude into your home and do something horrible, this is even worse. So if we think about the Pachamama thing, it's bad, obviously, but it's clearly idolatry. It's to the naked eye, this is not Catholic. But the problem with this is not just some sort of heretical activity. This is a deception. So the world is now going to be given the impression that something Christian took place. But this is a deep fake of the Mass. It is not the Mass. And it's presented as if it is. This is evil to a degree, in my opinion, that is worse than the Pachamama ritual. Because not only the Pachamama ritual is obviously heretical, but we can look at that and say, this is just a false religion. This isn't Catholicism. But now what they're doing with this Anglican service overseen by a Freemason who is divorced and remarried, what they're doing is they're performing a fake Catholic Mass. This is completely satanic and diabolical. There aren't words strong enough to express just how bad this is. If you're just joining us now, Pope Francis, well, the Vatican, and of course we would understand Pope Francis knows, and we know that one of these fellows did meet with Pope Francis as part of a visit to Rome, so of course he was aware they were there. You can see here on the screen that Francis has allowed Anglicans to say a quote-unquote Mass in the Lateran, the mother church of the Catholic Church. Would he allow the SSPX to celebrate Mass at the Lateran or even allow the traditional Latin Mass? I think not. And here's an image of this pretend Mass taking place. Here's a good question from someone in the chat. They said, can a valid Mass take place in the cathedral now, or must it be reconsecrated? Well, the valid consecration of the Eucharist can take place no matter what, as long as the priest says the proper words with bread bread and wine. So St. Thomas Aquinas talks about how if a priest were to go into a bakery and say the words of consecration with a proper intention, this would be inadvisable and terrible, but you would actually have a bakery full of the body of Christ. This is wrong, and it would be a grave act of sacrilege, but it would still take place. And this brings up one more thing I wanted to bring up about how scandalous this is. So I want to pull up something here from Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And I'm going to read soon just a quick passage from his book, Open Letter to Confused Catholics. So I'll give you a little bit of background. So the Anglicans, for a time, they did have valid priests. The Anglicans, for a time, did have a valid Mass. But after a certain amount of time, the Church itself changed its perception and understanding of the priesthood and ordination. So what happened is that the ordinations became invalid. So there was this weird period in, let's say, the 1600s or so, where in England there were valid priests who were basically schismatical priests, but they were validly consecrated because the Church of England did have valid apostolic succession for a time. So there were these valid priests who were saying what actually were masses, but then down the road there could be a newly ordained priest who was saying what was just a service. And the reason why they were no longer valid priests is because of the change in intention. Intention is necessary for sacraments. Now, it's not necessary to have deep faith. It's not necessary to have a profound belief in something in order for the intention to be valid. Ultimately, what is necessary is that you have to intend to do what the Church intends to do. It's a very low bar, thankfully, and that validity is for our purposes. But nonetheless, if the intention sufficiently changes, then the sacrament no longer happens. Okay, so let's read this quick passage here from Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. He was talking about how there is a reasonable conclusion you can come to that many masses of the Novus Ordo are invalid because of intention. And he uses the Anglican analogy. And I want you to bear with me here and just try to consider what I'm saying. So here we have this passage. I'll remove this here from Lefebvre, and I'll make this a little bit bigger so everyone can see it. So he's talking about the conditions for a valid sacrament. And he says the third condition of a valid sacrament is a right intention. The bishop or priest must have the intention of doing what the Church wills to be done. Not even the Pope can change that. As an aside there, when people say the Pope is the supreme authority, he is. But that authority can't go against the faith. This is an example. And Lefebvre goes on to say, the priest's faith is not among the necessary elements. This is true. A priest or bishop may no longer have the faith. Another may have it less. And another, a faith that is not quite complete. That has no direct effect on the validity of the sacraments they administer, but may have an indirect one. And here's the kicker. He said, one remembers Pope Leo XIII's decision that Anglican ordinations are invalid through a defect of intention. Now, it was because they had lost the faith, which is not only faith in God, but in all the truths contained in the Creed, including, quote, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, that the Anglicans have not been able to do what the Church wills. And that's very important here. He says, they have not been able to do what the Church wills. So do you have to have a deep faith in the Eucharist in order to do what the Church wills? No, you don't, in the sense of some sort of personal, intrinsic faith that you have. But you do have to believe what the Church teaches and intends to do in order to properly intend to do it. Now, there are theologians who will debate on the gravity of intention. So if we look at some of the works that have been accumulated from Aquinas, there was Cardinal Billot, who was a great cardinal of the Church under the Piuses in the early part of the last century. Pius X, 11th, maybe even Benedict XV, I would imagine, for a while. Anyway, he resigned under Pope Pius XI as a cardinal, though, because of some political thing. And anyway, but the point is, there's a work that was put together by Cardinal Billot where he goes over necessary intention. Now, if you look at this work, this is from the 1910s and 20s, somewhere around there. And he's looking at intention for sacraments using the old formulations for sacraments. And that's a really big difference because the old formulations for sacraments were expressly obvious. They were explicit. When you read the old missal, it is extremely clear what is happening. And Cardinal Bulot's conclusion on reading these thoughts from Aquinas and presenting these to the faithful, they express that because they're so explicit, it's almost impossible for a priest to offer an invalid mass in the old rite, because just by mouthing the words that are clear, the priest expresses at least an exterior intention to do what the church intends to do. But since the Mass changed, it is now vague in the Novus Ordo what actually takes place. This is where Lefebvre goes on to say, he says, are not priests who lose the faith in the same case as the Anglicans? There are already priests who no longer wish to confect the sacrament of the Eucharist according to the Council of Trent's definition. No, they say. The Council of Trent was a long time ago. Since then, we have had Vatican II. Now it's transsignification or transfinalization, transubstantiation, the real presence of the Son of God under the appearance of bread and wine. Not in these days. When a priest talks like this, he makes no valid consecration. There is no Mass or communion, for Christians are obliged to believe what the Council of Trent has defined about the Eucharist until the end of time. No one can make the terms of a dogma clearer. One can make the terms of a dogma clearer, but not change them. That is impossible. Vatican II did not add anything or retract anything, and it could not have done so. Anyone who declares that he does not accept transubstantiation is, in the terms of the Council of Trent, anathema, and is cut off from the church. He says, this is why Catholics in this latter part of the 20th century, this is 40 years ago he's reading this, have a duty to be more vigilant than their fathers were. They must not let just any idea be imposed upon them in the name of the new theology or of the new religion, for what this new religion wants is not what the church wills. This is extremely important. What Archbishop Lefebvre is saying here is that because the intentionality behind the new Mass paradigm is so vague, that it is entirely possible that a priest could expressly will to not do what the church wills while still saying the words that are in the sacramental rituals. This is what's different from the past. In the past, even take a big, heretical, erroneous theologian like Teilhard de Chardin. Well, Teilhard de Chardin, for all his ideas being terrible, he himself said the old Mass, and it would have been virtually impossible to not have at least an exterior intention to do what the church wills, because it was impossible not to. When the Mass changes, that goes away. And I want you to ask yourself a question. Let's have a rhetorical question here. If we truly receive sacramental grace at Mass, then this should have an effect on our life. I don't know how to formulate this in some sort of sophisticated way, but when I look at what has happened since the Second Vatican Council and the new Mass specifically, Catholics just stopped believing in the real presence. They just did. How could they stop believing in the real presence if they were receiving the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ every Sunday? Well, the reason they could, of course, there's relative reasons subjective to each person why you could stop believing. But how could a person just stop? Well, you could stop because that thing was no longer transmitted to you. You see, we receive sanctifying grace in order that we can be perfected. Sanctifying grace is not for God, it's for us. This brings me to my last point that I want to make here. If you're just joining us right now, I will recap here. In the Pope's Cathedral, St. John Lateran, an Anglican service has taken place, and this was done with obviously the express permission of the Vatican. There was a visit by Anglican ministers to the Holy Father, and nothing happens in there without this taking place, without permission. And we can look here at these images. We turn up here and we find this. That's the minister taking a selfie. Don't take a selfie if you're a priest or even a minister. It's kind of cringe, especially during a Mass or even a service. This is Bishop Jonathan Baker. He is a divorced and remarried Freemason, and he has defended his Freemasonry. saying that, the quote's in here, where is it? He defended himself, hold on one sec. He said, "For many years I have been an active member and I continue to be a member of Freemasonry." And he went on to defend why he doesn't think it's going to be a problem. And here he is, the principal celebrant of this. This is a idolatrous, Freemasonic, heretical service in the church. It is my opinion that this church is now desecrated because what took place was idolatry of a fake Eucharist, which is not God. So an act of idolatry overseen by a Freemason took place within the Pope's Cathedral. Just for people in the chat here, I was talking about Cardinal Bilot, not Cardinal Vilo. Different men. Yeah, Vilo was evil, Bilot was not. Okay, so this is the last point that I want to make here, because this should be a warning for Catholics about the new Mass, because the new Mass is basically the Anglican service. If you actually look at the formulation, it's basically the same thing. And the Anglicans themselves have said that. So often when you talk about the Mass and you criticize the new Mass, the constant rebuttal is what? It is, well, it's valid. What's the problem? Well, my friend Taylor Marshall always jokes, that's like saying, do you have a good marriage? And someone says, well, my marriage is valid. Sure, I cheat on my wife all the time, but whatever, it's valid. This is obviously absurd. Even a valid sacrament of any sort can be unworthy. Okay, now why do we know this? Well, two reasons. First, we need to go back to Cain and Abel. Now, you remember the story of Cain and Abel. They go out to the fields and they offer two sacrifices to God. Abel offers the sacrifice of the lamb. Cain offers the sacrifice of the grain. What's the problem here? God accepts Abel's, he doesn't accept Cain's. This is not because Cain's is not valid. And we know this because if you look at Old Testament worship, there were grain offerings that took place as part of the official valid worship of the Old Covenant. It's not that Cain offered the wrong material, it's that Cain had the wrong intention. Abel offered a lamb. Now, both brothers, they're offering a lamb and grain. And why is that? This is to show us that Christ will offer himself as the lamb under the form of bread. So lamb and grain, the lamb that is bread. You see that? It also shows us that the older brother will kill the younger brother and he will be sacrificed because of his hatred. This is what the Jews do to Christ. Cain is the older brother. He is the old covenant. Abel is the younger brother. This is the new covenant. You see the symmetry here. The reason why Cain's sacrifice is not accepted is because Cain offers it with the wrong intention. It doesn't mean it's not valid. It means it's not worthy. It's not accepted. It's not enough for a Mass to be valid. If we look into the texts of the Old Mass, and I don't have them in front of me, but if you look in there, you will find that the priests are basically begging God to accept the sacrifice. In the New Mass, there's a slight mention to, accept this sacrifice. But in the Old Mass, it is very clear that there is a liturgical understanding that you could offer a Mass and that Mass would not be accepted by God as a worthy sacrifice. And what does that mean? People will say, how is that possible? The consecration of the Eucharist takes place. This makes it a valid sacrifice. Yes, it makes it valid. But why would it be that in the old rite liturgies, probably in the East as well, if you look into it, why would it be that there would be petitioning God to accept the sacrifice? Because it's possible that he won't. You see? Otherwise, why would you ask? That would be absurd. That doesn't mean it's not valid if it's not accepted, but the validity is, yes, it's for the sacrifice, but the sacramental grace is for the faithful. The liberal Catholics and stuff love to say things like, God is not bound by the sacraments. And this is true. They've used that too far to explain away the need for the sacraments. But there's a truth to that. God is not bound by the sacraments. God doesn't need to receive sanctifying grace. God is perfect. You need to receive sanctifying grace. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. So a Mass can be valid, and someone here in the chat said valid but not licit. A Mass can be valid, but it can also be unworthy in how it's offered. And a very easy example of this is, think, for example, a satanic ritual where a validly ordained Catholic priest could offer a Mass, which is valid, but clearly that Mass is offensive to God. In some mysterious way, if the proper intention is there, then there is a valid consecration of the Eucharist, which is a valid sacrament. But that's not the same as that being a worthy sacrifice, a worthy offering to God. Someone here in the chat asked, can a Catholic Mass be valid after this horrendous idolatry? Yes, of course it can. Because again, validity is a very low bar. As long as a priest goes in there and says Mass and he says the proper words over the proper matter with the proper intention, then yes, this is valid. If you're just joining us now, a Freemason bishop of the heretical Anglican Church oversaw a idolatrous liturgy. Idolatrous, and you can see them preparing for the actual quote-unquote Mass. An idolatrous liturgy. Idolatrous because they don't have a real consecration. And it was done by, as I said, a Freemasonic bishop who is divorced and remarried. And we showed that, citing an article from 10 years ago, whenever it was, that he defended his activity in Freemasonry, and he himself says there's no problem with it. This means that this church in Rome has been desecrated, in my opinion. I mean, just sort of like how the Pachamama came into St. Peter's. This is a huge problem. Just before I sign off here, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll try to answer a few. I've got a few more minutes. Just as a reminder, Freemasonry has been condemned explicitly by the popes basically a dozen times. You are not able to be a Freemason and be a Catholic. You excommunicate yourself from the church. Someone asked, please talk about how the Pope has given the demonic Church of England pieces of the true cross for the coronation of Charles. Heresy, they even had it placed in a cross to bless Charles. This is a huge problem as well. I don't know if you call this heresy. I guess you call it sacrilege. It's not monarchy is a funny thing because monarchy is very much part of the sort of natural law. So we wouldn't say that the monarchy itself isn't a real monarchy. On the one hand, I guess one could make the argument something like maybe the true cross relic will, I don't know, spark him to faith or something like that. And yes, the English monarchy does have ties to Freemasonry. Nonetheless, this bishop who offered this Mass, this fake Mass, is a legitimate Freemason, and he's defended himself as such. There he is. He is divorced and remarried. He oversaw a idolatrous pretend Mass in Rome. And you can see here behind the bishop, maybe I can find the picture. There it is. Right over here behind him. This is the Cathedral. This is the chair of the Pope. And this is a huge problem. Thanks to Protect the Faith on Twitter, Nick Donnelly, for showing this. And I was able to find it on Facebook as well. Ladies and gentlemen, pray for Pope Francis. Pray for the reconsecration of this church. This is absolutely terrible what has happened. This is worse than Pachamama. Anyway, as always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report, and until next time, God bless you all.